This probably goes without saying, but being enslaved was one of the worst fates any human could endure. Stripped of freedom, family, and dignity, it was the complete negation of personhood. And yet for thousands of years, societies around the world built their wealth on it. Kings, merchants, priests, and politicians all saw slavery not as a moral stain, but as a normal part of how the world worked. For those at the top, owning other humans wasn't just profitable, it was power. So here's the question that should make all of us pause. If slavery was so deeply woven into human civilization, if it made nations rich, if it endured for literally millennia, then why did it stop? The easy answer would be to say, because we became better people, because we grew a conscience, because it was evil. And yes, it was evil, but that's not the whole story. Moral arguments against slavery existed for centuries, even in ancient times. They didn't end it. Slave uprisings came and went. They didn't end it either. And the economies that relied on slavery were incredibly powerful. So how did something that lasted for at least 10,000 years, something that was as old as civilization itself, collapse in just over a century? I'm your channel name, and today we're looking at the real reason slavery died. Because as much as we like to think it ended purely because of morality, the truth is much more complicated, and in some ways, much less flattering to us as a species. In this video, we'll trace the fall of slavery from 3 different angles: how religion and philosophy transformed human morality, how the enslaved themselves resisted and reshaped the system from within, and how economics, of all things, finally broke it beyond repair. By the end, we'll see how a system that lasted for at least 10,000 years, something that was as old as civilization itself, collapsed in just over a century. And today we're looking at the real reason slavery died. Because as much as we like to think it ended purely because of morality, the truth is much more complicated, and in some ways much less flattering to us as a species.
For most of human history, religion didn't condemn slavery, it justified it. Every major faith on earth, in one form or another, accepted it as natural. The Bible, the Quran, the Vedas, ancient Chinese texts all described societies where some people were simply owned by others. In the Old Testament, there were even detailed instructions on how to buy, sell, and treat slaves, rules for when they could be freed and how harshly they could be punished. The New Testament doesn't ban it either. Jesus never said a word against the practice, and Paul even told slaves to obey your masters. In Islam, the Quran regulated slavery rather than outlawing it. Freeing a slave was considered a good deed, but the institution itself was not forbidden. And across Africa, Asia, and the Americas, indigenous systems of bondage already existed long before Europeans arrived. Slavery was simply part of the natural order. It was as old and unquestioned as war or hunger. In most ancient societies, people weren't seen as equals before the law. Your worth was tied to your rank, your gender, your birth. If you killed a nobleman, you paid a heavy fine. If you killed a slave, the fine might be a fraction of that, because a slave was not a person but property. And for thousands of years, that moral hierarchy went unchallenged. No great philosopher of Greece or Rome seriously called for slavery's end. Even Aristotle, whose name is still synonymous with reason, argued that some people were slaves by nature. It wasn't until the late 1600s, in the Age of Enlightenment, that the foundation began to crack. Thinkers like John Locke, Montesquieu, and Voltaire started writing about natural rights, the radical idea that every human being was born with certain freedoms that no ruler or system could take away. Now let's be clear, most of these men were hypocrites. Locke himself invested in companies that traded slaves while writing about liberty and equality. But their ideas had power. Ideas have a way of leaking into places their creators never intended. Those Enlightenment principles began to reshape religion itself. Faith was no longer just about obedience or hierarchy, it became about conscience. People began to ask, if God created all men, then how can one man own another? That question didn't appear overnight, But by the early 1700s, small groups were beginning to answer it. One of the first was the Quakers, a Christian sect that rejected violence and hierarchy in all forms. As early as the late 1600s, Quaker communities banned slave ownership outright. They wrote letters, sermons, and pamphlets calling slavery a sin against both God and nature. They were radicals in their time, tiny in number but huge in influence. And they weren't arguing about trade or politics. They framed slavery as a theological crime, a moral disease eating away at the soul of society. For decades, they were mocked or ignored. Even in America, churches in the South used the same Bible to defend the practice, insisting that it was blessed by Scripture. They said slavery brought civilization to Africans, and Christian masters were doing God's work. But then something changed, a wave of emotion, revival, and moral awakening that historians now call the Great Awakening. Starting in the 1330s, evangelical preachers began sweeping through Europe and North America. They rejected cold theology and hierarchy and instead preached personal salvation, a direct emotional relationship with God. That movement turned faith into action. It wasn't enough to be saved, you had to live out your salvation. If you truly believed in the grace of God, you had to fight injustice where you found it. And so, out of those revivals, a new kind of Christian emerged, the activist believer. Men and women who saw it as their duty to make society match their faith. Many of America's earliest abolitionists came directly from this movement. They were ministers, teachers, reformers, people who felt called to bring heaven a little closer to earth. And by the early 1800s, churches across the northern United States had split from their southern counterparts. Methodists, Baptists, Presbyterians, each fractured over the question of slavery. The divide wasn't just political, it was spiritual. For centuries, religion had blessed slavery. Now it was beginning to curse it. And when faith turned against the system, it carried something more powerful than politics or profit. It carried legitimacy. When ordinary people began to see slavery not just as unpleasant, but as sinful, the moral tide turned. Suddenly, abolition wasn't just an idea for philosophers, it was a cause for preachers, parents, and shopkeepers. They signed petitions, organized boycotts, and printed pamphlets that spread across continents. And for the first time in human history, a moral argument against slavery began to go viral. But ideas alone weren't enough, because even as hearts were changing, entire economies still ran on slave labor. And as any economist can tell you, the people who profit rarely give up that profit willingly. That's where the second force comes in, not preachers or philosophers, but the enslaved themselves. For as long as slavery has existed, enslaved people have fought against it. Some resisted with open rebellion, others in quieter, subtler ways, but the fight never stopped. In every empire, from Rome to the Americas, you'll find stories of uprisings, escapes, and small acts of defiance. What changed in the modern era wasn't the will to resist, it was the scale and the consequences. By the late 1700s, European empires had industrialized slavery. What was once a system of household servants and prisoners of war became a massive global enterprise. Entire economies in the Caribbean, the American South, and Brazil depended on forced labor to produce sugar, cotton, and tobacco. Slavery wasn't a local issue, it was international business, backed by banks, governments, and armies. That made resistance far more dangerous, but also far more impactful.
And yet, morality did matter. The pressure from churches, abolitionists, and ordinary citizens gave government the push to act when the system was already wobbling. Britain's navy spent decades hunting down slave ships. America fought a civil war to end it. It wasn't just a moral awakening, it was moral conviction meeting economic reality. By the late 1800s, slavery, the institution that had defined humanity for 10,000 years, was gone from nearly every modern nation. Not because humans suddenly became good, but because conscience and commerce finally pointed in the same direction. Today, we like to believe progress is inevitable, but history says otherwise. Slavery didn't vanish by itself. It was fought, resisted, and dismantled piece by piece. It ended when it could no longer justify itself morally, politically, or financially. And that's the real reason slavery died. Not because evil disappeared, but because the world changed faster than evil could adapt. I am Jimmy Lee, and thanks for watching. If you made it this far, you're the kind of person who likes to understand why history happens, not just what happened. Stay curious, and I'll see you next time.